Okay, thank you. So my research focus on the how ecosystem works, actually trying to understand how ecosystem works and trying to understand how climate change is impacting ecosystem and ultimately their greenhouse gas emission. I've been working on a variety of ecosystems, both natural and managed, including Arctic tundra, oak forest, and peatland drained for agriculture. Ecosystems are complex. That's why it's important to combine a variety of approaches when trying to understand how they work and how they will react to environmental change. And that is why I'm using the plot scale, chamber measurements, but also coupling them with laboratory multifactorial manipulation, trying to understand the impact of different factors on these ecosystems. Also the larger ecosystem eddy covariance, ecosystem scale eddy covariance towers, and I'm also using remote sensing to try to understand the temporal change of this ecosystem functioning, and also upscaling these plot scale measurements. And I'm finally collaborating with modelers to try to understand the future. So some of my research results. This is on a paper we published just a few weeks ago on peatland drain for agriculture. Why peatland are important? They only cover 3% of the land area, but they are actually storing about 30% of all carbon on land. So they are a really important carbon storage. Of course, you have this very rich soil. The farmer wants to drain them, have been draining them for agriculture. To establish agricultural production. Of course, they are very productive soil, but the drainage of this peatland is leading to soil compaction, peat oxidation. We are losing this drain peatland at a rate of about 1 to 2 centimeters per year, which means if you have a 1 meter depth deep peat in 50 to 100 years, you won't have anything left. So the farmers are actually concerned about this, and they are trying to figure out a way to have a more sustainable agricultural production. And that's why we did this experiment in consultation with some farmers. This was a large farm, about 3,000 hectares. So what we tested, if we could increase the water table without affecting the agricultural production. So you see these lines, red and blue. So what we did, we increased the water table to from minus 50 centimeters below the surface, that's what the farmers are using, to 30 centimeters below the surface. So we increased this water table, and we saw a decrease in the CO2 loss. So positive value means loss. And at the same time, actually, the agricultural production, so this is negative value, means uptake of carbon, the agricultural production increased, and at the end, when we harvest all the crops, we found a higher biomass with a higher water table. My student published a paper. He was interviewed by the BBC, which is great news because it really tells you that these topics are of interest to our society, and our society is trying to move towards a more sustainable agricultural production. Now, from drained peatland in temperate ecosystem, going up north, this is another paper we published last year looking at the year-round methane fluxes from the Arctic. And what we found with this paper was actually the cold period was contributing to about 50% of the entire emission during the entire year. Why this is important? Because this cold period have been notoriously ignored by most model simulations. So if we really want to understand the impact of climate change on this system, we need to be able to study also what's going on during this cold period. For this work, we coupled our eddy covariance towers to aircraft measurements from the NASA curve. So these lines are our eddy covariance towers. These dot, diamonds, and squares are the flux is estimated from the aircraft. As you can see, there is a consistency between the two measurements, which means that what we see at our ecosystem scale at the covariance site is consistent to what has been recorded over the larger regional scale from this aircraft campaign, which is important to put our research results into a larger scale perspective. Now, the next question from here will be how this emission will change with climate change. And of course, at the time, we were not being able to answer, and this is the work, and now my PhD student, Kyle, is doing, trying to model the interannual variability in the emission and understanding what's controlling it. At the time, we had 1.5 years of data. Now Kyle is working with nearly 4 years of data. So if you want to have the answer, you need to be nice to him, and he might be able to give you some more information about this. Now, what about permafrost? When I give a talk about the Arctic, this is usually a question that I get, what's going on with the permafrost? And this is another paper we published last year, in which we use remote sensing to try to identify the changes over the entire landscape. These are images from the 50s or 80s, and we compare these earlier images to the images in the 2000s, and then we identify the changes. So the yellow area means drier, the blue areas means wetter, so we saw actually a substantial permafrost degradation over a variety of sites across the Arctic. So what's the next step from here would be trying to understand how this permafrost change is actually affecting the vegetation and the greenhouse gas emission. That's why my other PhD student, Scott, is now working with some of the images in the sites in which we also had greenhouse gas flux measurement, both chambers and eddy covariance, is trying to identify how the vegetation change is actually affecting the fluxes. And from his preliminary work, he's actually already noticed that over a decadal time range, which is a very short time for the vegetation, there is actually a huge difference in the vegetation from some of these sites. So the green are this wet sedge meadow community. As you can see, there is a large expansion of these wet sedge communities over these drier mesic sedge meadows that are these more yellowish color, which means that this is probably related to the hydrological change, but this is also probably affecting the fluxes over the entire period. So what we are trying to do now is trying to couple these remote sensing images to the actual fluxes and see if we can pick up these changes based on our eddy covariance tower, and also if we can model this over the larger scale. And with this one, if you're interested in this work, this is coming up. We hope to complete this paper soon, but stay tuned for the results. And I want to finish up by thanking everybody. This is the work of many, many people and many funding agencies that supported this work over the last decades. And I hope that I have some time for questions. Okay, thank you.
I noticed on your methane and CO2 measurement, the error bars, how do they compare between tower and aircraft, and was the aircraft real time, or were you collecting sample and bringing it down?
This one?
No, the next one. Yeah.
Oh, this
How
one,
did-
it's only tower.
Okay.
It's not
Only the
aircraft.
So for your aircraft collection, are they dynamic real-time on-site or?
So the airplane actually collected the concentration at different layers and then simulated using a model the fluxes, but they're not actual fluxes.
But they're onboard analyzers.
Actually, I was going to ask you about this slide. Your main point in the PNAS paper was you get, I think you said 50% fluxes of methane in the winter. But this chart seems to show January, March, very low levels, and even on the other side where the main emissions are July and September.
So the 50% is the entire cold period. So what we define as a cold period was from September onwards until basically the end of May. So from here to over here, something like that. And because the emission during the fall is so high, when you sum everything, it's 50%. Yeah, so it's not the winter only. So the winter only will be much lower number.
But it's all snow covered. So late August until end of May is snow covered.
Oh, okay.
Donatella, can you elaborate on your use of the multi-method approach to study the phenomena that you study? What kind of phenomena can you bring to the lab and experimentally manipulate versus studying through an observational method? And how do these methods inform and complement each other?
Okay, that's an excellent question. So, this one. Okay, so when you go in the field and you measure the fluxes, of course you have the entire ecosystem, you have all vegetation types in this, unless you measure different vegetation types, but you cannot separate things that change together. So this is a notoriously problem when you do the statistics on this data, because the increase in temperature is related to a decrease in the water table, an increase in the depth of thaw during the summer, flowering of the vegetation. So everything happens together. So when you go and regress things in the field, yes, you are using field conditions which are more representative of the ecosystems, but many of the variables you are trying to separate actually co-vary. So in a way, it's really nearly impossible to know if it's the increase in the temperature or if it is in the increase in depth of thaw, because they happen together. So in the lab, what it's attractive of doing a multifactorial experiment in the lab is to be able to finally separate these different interacting factors. And on top of this, there is nearly no way you are able to estimate how elevated CO2 is going to affect this system, because it's so expensive to be able to do an elevated CO2 experiment in the field, in the Arctic, and has never been done before, just because the budgets are nearly impossible. And elevated CO2 is actually one of the most important factors that the modelers are now assuming that is going to affect the methane emission from the Arctic. So, and this has never been tested before. So the modelers think with elevated CO2, the plants are going to be stimulated, there is going to be more uptake of carbon, more labile carbon to the roots, in the soil, and more methane emission. This is what the modeler thinks. What we think is exactly the opposite. We think that the soil is so full of carbon that by adding additional labile carbon is not going to stimulate any more methane. We don't think that the impact of the elevated CO2 will result in an increase in methane emission. We cannot prove it. Nobody has proved this before. This is a huge gap in the knowledge and a very critical, important unanswered question that I think we can only answer with this. And this is, if we can answer this, we're going to be the one that are putting really this processing on the map, because nobody has tested this before.
If I could just add something, to do these kinds of experiments right takes some very expensive laboratory equipment that right now Donatella is working very hard to see if she can get. But that equipment will allow not only these studies, but it will allow other collaborators to also add to the climate change studies on our campus.
One last question, then we got to move on. I was surprised that your carbon locked up in the peat was so high at 30%, if I got that graph right. And yet when you think about sort of carbon sinks, you think of deforestation. Are people worried about depeating?
Which one? This one?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So the question, are the peatlands in any kind of jeopardy as far as urbanization or transference to other kinds of systems? Or are they a pretty secure system?
Oh, I think it really depends on their location. In temperate ecosystem, they are subjected to a substantial land use change. 14% of the peatlands in Europe and 40% of the peatlands in the UK are being drained for agriculture. So it's a huge number in temperate peatland. Of course, in like tropical peatland, also now the numbers are substantial because there is a lot of land use change, so they are also under a lot of human pressure. Probably in the north, in the Arctic peatlands are less subjected to land use change just because the agricultural pressure is lower, but it really varies, but they are definitely under pressure.
Thank you so much.